5. Training in reasoning. Since the vogue in this country of the Herbartian pedagogy, which I hope is far weaker where it touches such sciences as I happen to be acquainted with than anywhere else, though it seems strange that of a philosophy not altogether distinguished for sobriety in its theoretical departments this practical part should alone remain in high favor, the old ideas which used to cluster about the phrase liberal education have become scattered. One of those ideas was that the matter of instruction in the common education was of less concern than the training of men's powers. The pedagogists of today sneer at this as an antiquated and crude conception. But for my part I continue to believe that the welfare of the Commonwealth depends far less on the assent of all the citizens to any definite propositions, such, we will say, as the doctrine of the independence of the executive, legislative, and judiciary functions, which, after all are easily made handles for bosses, than it does in the power of recognizing the sort of thought and the sort of methods in which it will be well for the government and public opinion to put their trust. In the last analysis it comes to this, that the very focus and center of common education should be placed in the art of thinking, ad omnium methodorum principia viam habens, which contains a path to the principles of all methods. I do not know why a man should not devote himself to the training of his reasoning powers with as much assiduity as to corporal athletics. There are a good many books that bear upon the subject. Some of the logics pay attention to this matter, such as L'Art de Penser of the Port Royalists, Bennick's Logic, and Dresloff's 2 treatises. Then there are irregular logical essays, the Registre d'Esprit of Descartes and the first book of the Novum Organum. There are special works devoted to the consideration of the matter. The Medicina Mentis promises what it fails to perform. But Locke's Conduct of the Understanding, Watts's Improvement of the Mind, a work in the highest degree useful and pleasing, remarked Johnson, Senebia's Art d'Observer, and many others might be mentioned. In addition there are various books of exercises, more or less trivial, more or less calculated to inculcate machine-made discussions, the ready logic of the English leader-writer, a vicious habit fatal to all living and healthy reasoning. I will not say, however, that a moderate use of such books is altogether useless. I would not absolutely condemn even Schwann's studies in deductive logic, although the author shows in his own person how very unadroit a reasoner a man of real ability may be. But neither reading books nor working exercises, whether they be trivial or serious, will suffice to develop the reasoning powers. An analytical method of procedure is requisite which shall perfect one by one our performance of the different mental operations that enter into the business of inquiry. Now the mental operations concerned in reasoning are 3. The first is observation, the second is experimentation, and the third is habituation. Observation consists of 2 parts which though theoretically they have much in common yet practically are of almost contrary natures. The first is a sort of subconscious induction, by which upon repeatedly reviewing an object of perception a certain element of it acquires great association or potency, that is, has a magnified tendency to call up other ideas. For example, I cast my eyes, let us say, upon an impressionist marine picture, one of those things in which the wet pastels are affixed in blotches nearly as large as the end of your little finger. It has a very disagreeable look and seems very meaningless. But as I gaze upon it I detect myself sniffing the salt air and holding up my cheek to the sea breeze. That subconscious element of observation is, I am strongly inclined to think, the very most important of all the constituents of practical reasoning. The other part of observation consists in molding in the upper consciousness a more or less skeletonized idea until it is felt to respond to the object of observation. This last element is quite indispensable if one is trying to form a theory of the object in hand, or even to describe it in words, but it goes a long way toward breaking down, denying, and pooh-poohing away all the fineness of the subconscious observation. It is, therefore, a great art to be able to suppress it and put it into its proper place in cases where it attempts impertinent intim in reasoning 183. Do not allow yourself to be imposed upon by the egotism and conceit of the upper consciousness. Observation may also be divided into 3 nearly independent genera according to the different natures of the elements observed. Namely, it may be directed to the qualities of objects or to experimental facts of relation, or to the relations between the parts of an image one's own fantasy has created. These are all observations, composed of the 2 elements I have mentioned. Nevertheless, they are so far different that in training one kind you do not necessarily strengthen either of the others in any sensible measure. It consequently becomes necessary to train each of these 3 modes of observation separately. The qualities which we observe may, in the first place, be sensible qualities, colors, sounds, sizes, shapes, etc. Or, in the second place, they may be secondary, or emotional, qualities, such as the aesthetic qualities. A training in discrimination of sensible qualities will affect the power of discriminating emotional qualities in no inconsiderable measure, and vice versa. Thirdly, there is observational discrimination of mental states, which in my experience has been found associated with sense discrimination much more frequently than I should have anticipated that it would be. All these powers are most important in reasoning, and I need hardly say that just as a person who has not frequented a gymnasium or its equivalent can in a single month amazingly bring up the strength of a given set of muscles by means of systematic exercise, so a person whose powers of observational discrimination have been neglected can by analogous exercises attain results quite as surprising. I am sure that I need not tell you how much education for the power of discrimination there is in practice with a photometer or color box. But, perhaps, you may be surprised that I should put such stress upon such exercises as contributing to the cultivation of the reasoning powers. I have certainly known men great in their powers of observational discrimination who nevertheless showed lamentable defects as reasoners. But I never knew a man whose sagacity as a reasoner compelled my admiration without finding in him a considerably cultivated discrimination. Perhaps the same ardent desire to learn which causes a man to become a good reasoner also causes him to cultivate his senses. I have known an ardent votary to truth to place himself under the tutelage of the sommelier of some famous cellars, until he could not only tell at once what class of Bordeaux he was tasting, but also the precise vintage within certain limits of time. He held, himself, that there was something of a rational education in it. Nor did he become a mere sybarite, but continued with the great poet of nature to prefer a crew that's not too high and good for human nature's daily food. It needed a great poet to make a rhyme like that. One, I will not say that every wine taster is a man of sense, but I will say that a man who, like an acquaintance of mine, can tell by smelling the percentage of real attar in attar of roses with a probable error of 2% will probably be a man whose acquaintance is worth making. If it was superfluous for me to speak of the intellectual benefit to be derived from the cultivation of sensuous discrimination, it is 10 times more so to speak of training in aesthetic discrimination. Of psychical discrimination there ought to be still less to be said, for its practical utility is too obvious. When I read Theophrastus, whose great strength, by the way, lay in his power of discrimination whether he was writing upon logic, or psychology, or botany, or what, or when I read La Bruyère and other French delineators of character down to Maupassant, or when I read George Eliot, I will accept Lavater, I must confess I am not half so much struck with the extraordinary fineness of their discriminations as I am with the comparative obviousness of the remarks they have thought worthy of registry. I have met with incomparably subtler observers. But then it is to be remembered that the first and most genuine element of observation, the subconscious observation, was not the principal task of those literary artists. What they mainly had to do was to translate observations into words, and to draw character sketches which the not too fine reader would recognize as agreeing with his own subconscious impressions. The art of looking at a man and reading what lies in his heart depends, I am sure, on no extraordinary faculty, but it can be carried to such perfection that its results seem miraculous. Lavater's essays de physiognomy are well worth careful study and comparison with the Book of Nature. One of the themes to which he constantly recurs is that the higher consciousness must not be allowed to obtrude itself between the observer and his object. For that reason comparatively little weight is to be allowed to his propositions in physiognomy. When he tells you that he judges by the shape of a man's nose, that you must remember, is only his theory of a process which in his own mind takes place behind a curtain which he is never able to lift. His personal judgments were said to be often very wonderful. Such a man as Goethe considered them to be so, I believe. But he tells us that his greatest successes have been impressions, unstudied, instantaneous, irresistible. On the other hand, he openly confesses to having committed the most ridiculous blunders, which he details in the rankest candor. For example, he tells us how on one occasion when, expecting to receive a portrait of the poet Herder, that which he actually received was a sketch of a ferocious and stupid murderer, before reading the letter of explanation, he went into rhapsodies over the sublime and noble inclinations which he fancied he detected in the head. Such errors are very instructive. When you desire to increase the sensitiveness of a balance, you raise the center of gravity of the beam. Fine balances are provided with a weight on a vertical screw over the fulcrum for this purpose. In your extreme effort after sensitiveness, you screw the center of gravity up till it is higher than the fulcrum, and then what happens is that, the next wrong weight you try will upset your balance as the phrase is, and the error of weighing may go to almost any length. It is just so with the fine observer when he screws himself up too fine. He is thrown off his balance. And then the great wine taster will mistake sherry for Madeira, the connoisseur of pictures will mistake Rembrandt for a Frans Hals, or the physiognomist will mistake a murderer for a moralist. The moral of it is that you must not judge of delicate discriminations by their occasional gross errors but by the proportion of their eminent successes. This applies for example to clairvoyance. If you choose to set it down as a humbug without examination, I for one shall applaud your good sense. For life is altogether too short to permit any person with business to do to investigate every monstrous story that is told him. But once you have made up your mind to enter upon the investigation, you cannot logically come to a negative conclusion because you discover your clairvoyant to be a liar. You knew from the first she was in an abnormal condition of nerves, and everybody whose nerves are not in perfect adjustment does lie. So that was what you had to expect from the outset. So far we have considered discrimination of characters. Now we come to observation proper, that is to say, observation of the relations of real objects and parts of objects external to us. Of all the varieties of this observation proper, it seems to me that the easiest must be that of objects of natural history, using the term in so wide a sense as to include, for example, the examination of banknotes, in short, the observation of things. For you generally have in the first place an assortment of specimens. Then you can handle a thing, turn it over, view it from different sides, and even avail yourself of instrumental aids to observation. Yet everybody knows that even this kind of observation requires professional training. To observe an event, especially one which is not repeated, is necessarily far more difficult. The whole art of the prestidigitator, depends on that difficulty. In the life of Robert Houdin, there is an account of the exercises which he and his son went through in learning the second sight trick. It is a good hint. Next, we may consider observations of character, which is an altogether different thing, by the way, from discrimination between qualities of character. One of the keenest observers I ever knew had this habit. He saw that I had an inkling of it, and so he took me into his confidence, thinking that would bind me not to betray him. Whenever he went into a large gathering of able men, which frequently happened, he would beforehand carefully select one topic upon which to converse with a number of men separately. As soon as he had learned the sentiments of any man on that subject, you might see him take out his tablets in a semi-distracted manner, make a single mark and put them up again. When he got home, he would not lay his head on his pillow until all those men's relative sentiments had been assiduously posted in a ledger. By relative sentiments, I mean, upon any given man's page of the ledger would be written, tendency to think so and so somewhat above the average. The result of this was that in the course of a few years he could tell accurately how any important man would feel about any given matter. I would not advise a man to devote much time to observations of oneself. The great thing is to become emancipated from oneself. Of Coe, O.T.E. Vrove, know thyself, make your own acquaintance, does not mean introspect your soul. It means see yourself as others would see you if they were intimate enough with you. Introspection, I mean a certain kind of fascinated introspection, on the contrary, is looking at yourself as nobody else will ever look at you, from a narrow, detached, and illusory point of view. Of course, a man must search his heart somewhat. It is highly needful. Only don't make a pursuit of it. There remains still another kind of power of observation which ought to be trained, and that is the power of observing the objects of our own creative fancy. In such objects, there are three different elements to which observation may be particularly directed. The first is the sensuous element, the second is the relations between different parts of the object, whether as coordinate parts or as governing one another, and the third is the system, the form, and the idea of the whole. In regard to the vividness of sensuous imagination, the differences between different persons are astonishing. Some men, myself among the number, are almost entirely destitute of this power. I can match colors from memory with a degree of precision quite beyond the average lady's, unless she be a Parisian. And yet when I look at a red thing, and then shut my eyes, I cannot sec anything in the least like the vision. You will here and there meet with a psychological writer who utterly denies that there is any power of reproducing a peripheral sensation, and I thought so too, until conversation with accurate observers convinced me that it was merely an idiosyncrasy of my own. You will see an artist put himself to some trouble to get a dark place by the side of his picture where he can project the image he is copying without its colors being modified by the actual ones upon which they are superimposed. 3. I am now satisfied, after a good deal of skepticism, that the power of observing the sensuous element of the image is conducive to good reasoning on the whole. Among exercises for strengthening the power of accurate dealing with the relations of parts of an image may be mentioned chess playing and the solution of the mathematical problems in the educational times. The English, who have proved themselves to be in some respects the best educated people in Europe, notwithstanding their artistic insensibility, pay much more attention than any others to practice with mathematical puzzles, and this is a practice that ought to be imitated. The highest kind of observation is the observation of systems, forms, and ideas. No other exercise I know of is half so good for strengthening this faculty as the study of pure mathematical theories, and practice in making ourselves such theories. I would not advise any man to go without reading Hegel's Phenomenology des Geistes, but in my opinion as a discipline for the mind it is almost immeasurably inferior to the study of mathematics. So much for the first of the three psychological operations involved in reasoning. The second is experimentation. In observation, the most essential condition is passivity, the inhibition of the natural tendency to meddle, to conjecturally amend, the dicta of nature. In experimentation, on the contrary, the most essential ingredient is energy, perseverance, in short, strong work of the will, both external and internal. In the dialect of the medieval writers on occult science, laborare means to make experiments. We now, for instance, perform abstraction, that is, we seize upon transient elements of thought and pin them down as subjects of thought. Accordingly, it is a fact beyond all doubt, that whatever strengthens the willpower, strengthens the powers of reasoning. I used to find it a salutary practice to lift 1,000 pounds dead weight 3 times a week. 5 Do that and you will not dread this or that line of thinking as too difficult and mathematical. A certain amount of contrivance is also called for in experimented on. It is nothing extraordinary. The chief qualities that this contrivance requires are, first, an agility of creative imagination which is a willpower that nothing can fatigue but is always begging for a harder task, second, a flair which abridges the work by enabling the man to pick out the suggestions probably best worth study, and third, perseverance, in tracing out different suggestions and tracing them out into sufficient detail to make sure of their advantages and disadvantages. The solution of chess problems makes a tolerably good practice in contrivance. Detached experiments, like detached thoughts or detached soldiers, are of little account. It is when they are massed into squads, and companies, and battalions, and regiments, and brigades, and divisions, and armies that they become strong and stronger. There are plenty of experiments that are easy to make and which in systematized masses are potent instruments of learning. An active mind ought always to be carrying on some systematic experimentation. An indispensable condition of systematization of any kind is systematic records. Everything worth notice is worth recording, and those records should be so made that they can readily be arranged, and particularly so that they can be rearranged. I recommend slips of stiff smooth paper of this exact size. By ordering 20,000 at a time, you get them cheap, and 20,000 will last an industrious student a year. For you won't average more than 60 a day and there will be, one way and another, a month of idleness in the year. Upon these slips you will note every disconnected fact that you see or read that is worth record. Besides that, you want a book of the same size containing 30, 40 pages, for nearly every day. A gross of such books only costs $1 or $2. Each book is a connected record of some little investigation. At the end of a year, you have 10,000 to 20,000 slips which you have arranged in bands, in envelopes, and in drawers or boxes, and you have near a gross of books. There is that part of your year's experience. After 30 years of systematic study, you have every fact at your fingers' ends. Think what a treasure you will have accumulated. There will not be a man or any subject of interest that you ever had dealings with, whose whole character you will not be able to survey at pleasure. Other records that ought to be systematically made I shall mention in a few moments. Experimentation is of 3 kinds, that which is made upon images of our own creation, that which is made upon outward things, and that which is made upon persons. But I have already said enough about them under the head of observation. Exercises for training in observation and in experimentation will differ mainly in this, that the former class are chosen for the difficulty of the passive element of the performance while the latter are chosen for the difficulty of the active part. i.e. third of the psychological operations involved in reasoning is habituation. The power of readily taking habits and of readily throwing them off. There is no habit more useful than this habit of easily taking up and easily throwing off mental habits. Let me briefly outline what one conceives to be the logical significance of habit. I have already said that from a logical point of view generality is continuity. A continuous curve, that is one whose differential coefficients are continuous, is one which can be described in general terms, that is, has an equation. True, the curve may have singularities, which are no doubt discontinuities. In reply to this objection, I shall at present content myself with remarking that the only kinds of point singularities a curve can have are chronodes, or points of crossing, cusps, and acnodes, or isolated points. Now chronodes and cusps are not strictly discontinuities of the point, but only of its differential coefficient. As for an acnode, the way in which it arises is this. The curve has 2 branches. There is no breach of discontinuity here, but mere plurality. Now one of those branches shrinks to a point and that gives the acnode. The rest of the curve is continuous and the acnode presents of itself no break. The two together are merely a curve with 2 branches. Thus in no case is there a pure point discontinuity, such as an extremity would be bifurcation. Those genuine discontinuities are impossible. But in my appended lecture, I shall take up this objection again and answer it much more thoroughly, explaining fully how it is that such singularities arise as do occur and demonstrating that they fully bear out and confirm the identity of continuity and generality. For I grant that my present reply to the objection is not entirely satisfactory, the acnode, at any rate, being undoubtedly an exceptional point, and therefore a breach of generality. But even taking it so, the puzzle is how a perfectly general description, like an equation, can intrinsically involve an exceptional case. My full reply will show that in truth it cannot do so, that the exception arises not out of the general description but at an attempt to reconcile 2 mutually contradictory hypotheses. Generality, then, is logically the same as continuity. But continuity is thirdness in its full entelechy. Now firstness, secondness, and thirdness are all pervasive categories, and appear in psychology with great clearness. Feeling quality, or immediate consciousness, is first, for the first is that which is whatever it is in and for itself. The sense of reaction between the inward and the outward, which takes the 2 forms of exertion and the shock of experience, is second, for the second is that which is as it is in the accident of something else. Now I hold with Reid that both in exertion and in experience, which really differ only in degree, we are directly conscious of an ego and another. This is no hypothesis to explain a datum. It is a datum, as much and in the same sense as any other result of introspective analysis is properly called a datum. In addition to these elements there is a direct consciousness of habit forming, or learning, equally a datum, which particularly appears in our consciousness of the flow of time, law tertium, which as you are aware is a synonym of medium, is defined as that which is as it is in the pairing of 2 other things, that is, in the bringing of them into relation with one another. Now the consciousness of the formation of mental habit, or association of ideas, is the consciousness of something coming to pass within us whereby a certain quality of experience will be connected with a certain quality of effort. You may object that this is not a direct datum of consciousness but rather of the nature of an inference. Could you establish that proposition you would only bring the thirdness, and the radical contrast with both feeling quality and the sense of reaction, into stronger prominence. And that there is an inferential character to it, I admit. That is the nature of thirdness. Nevertheless, I contend that it is impossible to escape the fact that the flow of time for instance is a direct datum of consciousness. It may be urged that the evidence is that consciousness oscillates up and down across the lumen, at the rate of 30 waves a second, so that we really have no such direct consciousness of a flow. I will grant you that, for the sake of argument, but every such objection only strengthens the conclusion. For how then do we get this idea of a flow? If there is nothing like it in sense, you must think it a sort of Kantian form of sense, an innate hypothesis which we inevitably apply even in the very teeth of the data. But this is only making it all the more a direct datum. You are supposing a consciousness behind the sense consciousness which sees the gaps in the sensor consciousness. In no other way could the atoms of consciousness get synthesized. To talk of its being untrue would be simply to forget what truth means, as Kant virtually says. That is to say, authentic Kantism and realism come to the same thing, at last. The consciousness of inferring is in a sense inferential, but in being inferential it is a direct datum, because it is the consciousness of the operation in its actual operation and as it really is. In short, the more objections you raise, the more thoroughly you are led to see that this consciousness of learning is a peculiar element of consciousness different from feeling quality and from the sense of reaction. If you say that this analysis of consciousness into three elements is merely a logical analysis, I reply that it is so utterly logical that it belongs not merely to subjective logic but to the logic of being. However, we have not time now to dwell further upon this point. The operation of acquiring associations is the third of the psychological operations involved in reasoning. It is a sort of generalization by which, for example, the middle term is dropped. Perfect readiness to assimilate new associations implies perfect readiness to drop old ones. It is the plasticity of childhood, which if a man is going to become a teacher, or an exponent of a fixed idea, or a mechanic at any immovable trade, or a settled man in any respect, it is just in so far best that he should outgrow. But so far as a man is to be a learner, a philosopher, it is most essential that he should preserve, and to do so he has to battle against a natural law of growth. To be a philosopher, or a scientific man, you must be as a little child, with all the sincerity and simple-mindedness of the child's vision, with all the plasticity of the child's mental habits. What are the exercises conducive to this? Extensive reading to begin with. 100 volumes a year or 3% days per volume does not sound like hard work. 50 volumes are easily read, if you can find so many good books. Real reading consists in putting oneself into the author's position, and assimilating his ways of thinking. Conversation with all sorts of people whom we do not altogether understand, freshens the mind, but then interesting people are as hard to find as interesting books. As a corrective to all that a suitable dose of rumination and solitude is indicated, provided that it be not idling, but intense and systematic activity of the most definite and diagrammatic thought. 6 In order to make thought systematic it should be recorded. The record should be brief and almost tabular. No laconism is to be permitted in the record. It should have the style of the obelisk which sets forth at which it has to express completely, clearly, and purely. Carry your train of thought to its terminus, and draw up the schedule of it in a copybook devoted to it, in such shape that 30 years after, if you wish to recur to it, the force and good sense and unity of the idea may compel you to say, after all, I wasn't such a fool in respect to what I did see, however much I may have failed to see. 7 There are 3 kinds of exercises which seem to be particularly suited to strengthen the power of habituation. Exercises in divisions and classifications, exercises in definitions and the logical analysis of ideas, and exercises in compacting theories or trains of reasoning. Now let me conclude this review of the best means of improving our reasoning powers by noticing the 3 fallacies which according to my experience are most apt to delude thinkers. I mean the positive fallacies, for not to have thought deeply enough and not to have carried out your thought to its extreme consequences, although these are the worst and commonest of all defects of thought, they do not imply any positive error. I will say parenthetically, however, that while in practical matters nothing is more unwise than to carry an idea to extreme lengths, yet in speculative thought, this is the greatest of locomotives for advancing upon the road to truth. Indeed, it is the extreme cases which alone teach you anything new. But one wish to notice one fallacy each in retroduction, in deduction, and in induction. The commonest fallacy of retroduction, as it seems to me, is the idea that the most probable hypothesis is the best. If you consult almost any treatise on logic you will find it laid down after Aristotle, that a hypothesis should be more antecedently probable than the facts which it serves to explain, and on the same principle a most probable hypothesis is superior to a less probable one. There is some reason in this, too. If you really can find an explanation having sufficient probability to be worth consideration, you escape in great measure from reposing upon retroduction and make your inference inductive. But probability in that sense of the term in which it is of value, is some positive information you possess. It is not mere seeming and not mere ignorance. The difficulty is that in most cases where resort is had to retroduction you know nothing about any factual probability. A much more useful maxim is, be upon your guard against assuming anything to be true because it seems likely or a matter of course, for that is the great source of delusions. All the most admirable rules of retroduction are more or less allied to this, such as that of Bentley, of various readings of good MSS prefer the most difficult. Still better is the modern formula. Adopt that reading which though it be not found in any MS best accounts for the readings that are found. This, you will remark, is sure to lead to the adoption of a reading not at all to be expected antecedently. You have to remember that any hypothesis is merely provisional. It will be sure to be corrected by and by. But you want to begin with the one which while it synthesizes the known facts can at the outset be most conveniently tested by comparison with observations you are most nearly ready to make. I regret I have not time to give an example of the fallacy I speak of, because any good example would require long discussion. But you can find examples in abundance in a work of ancient history by one of the masters of the modern method of internal criticism, whose results the still more modern archaeological method has treated so cruelly. Hulga's Griechist und Römische metrology is such a pagoda erected on quicksand. More in your line is Zeller's history of ancient philosophy. See the way he treats Pythagoras. He seems to think that because all our chief witnesses about Pythagoras are extremely untrustworthy therefore the safest way is to disbelieve everything they say. He makes a feeble attempt in the right direction when he disbelieves them most when what they all testify would in all probability have happened. When you have to rely entirely upon testimony, no matter what liars your witnesses may be, the best way to begin with is to accept what they say as far as you can believe them all, and where you cannot do that to adopt the simplest hypothesis which will account for their testifying as they do. It is possible in this way to get a conception of Pythagoras which explains every item of testimony remarkably well. It may not be altogether true, probably it is not, but it is the most rational hypothesis that we can at present frame. The worst fallacy of deductive reasoning consists in not reasoning at all, but only going by the rule of thumb. That is to say, the soi-disant reasoner has been in the habit of inferring in a certain way which in his experience has worked well, and he now roundly asserts its absolute necessity. The commonest form that this fallacy takes is that of treating every collection as if it were finite, and every sequence as if it must have a last or first, an assumption destitute of all shadow of reason and resting on brute habit merely. It is astonishing how many men go through the world successfully enough whose rational part seems altogether abortive. Somewhat more subtle forms of this fallacy are Euclid's assumption that every whole is greater than its part, and that reasoning of the doctrine of limits which thinks it proves a quantity to be zero by saying, if not, let E be its value, and goes on to show that the value is less than E. What this does prove is that the value of the quantity is less than that of any quantity chosen as E has been chosen, generally as a finite quantity. The proposition really proved is less than the truth, even though the proposition supposed to be proved is more than the truth. The most dangerous fallacy of inductive reasoning consists in examining a sample, finding some recondite property in it and concluding at once that it belongs to the whole collection, instead of definitely determining what the property to be tested is and then drawing a sample and testing the property with that sample. As an illustration of this fallacy, I shall take a paper by Dr. Peirce on the relations between the distances of the orbits of the planets. Dr. Peirce states that the law he expounds is an established fact. Considering that an established fact is one which all competent men admit, this is strong language. After some prefatory matter which need not be noticed, we come to the statement of the law in the following words. The theory is that twice the time of one planet's revolution is equal to the sum of its two neighbors. This is an awkward way of saying that the times of revolution of the successive planets are in arithmetical progression. Thus, I quote the exact words, thus, twice the period of the circuit of Venus, which is 450 days, is approximately equal to the revolution of Mercury, its interior neighbor, and that of the Earth its exterior. Suppose we make a little table. A $136.73 $140.56, Mercury, periodic times days $87.97, Venus, 224.70, Earth, 356.26. This does nicely. Now Mars is 6, Mars, 686.98 321.72. But how is this? Let us see what Dr. Peirce says to this. He says, again doubling this number, he means doubling twice the period of Venus. We have the sum of the revolutions of Venus and Mars. This is a way of saying that the period of Mars is thrice that of Venus, which makes the period of Mars depend exclusively on that of one and that one not a neighbor of it. 224.703 674.10. The relation 39 equals heart is however not 2% out. Now what about the asteroids? Their periodic time varies from 3/4 to 6 v 2 years, or say from 1200 to 2400 days. Dr. Peirce on this subject says, again, this number doubled, he means p/3 times the period of Mars doubled, is about equal to the revolution of the Earth and one of the asteroids. Now 2% d equals 1832 days. Subtracting 365 days we have 1467 for his asteroid period. He gives us no idea at all what the law prescribes the period of 2/I and $ shall be. And I am sure I cannot guess. The numbers are 5 Mars, 687 780 asteroids, 1467, 2865 LL, Jupiter, 4332 days 6428 carat 2, Saturn, 10760 days $19,929, Uranus, 30689 29499 carat / Neptune, 60188. I am sure they are not in arithmetical progression. But as to Neptune, whose period is 60188, he does tell us that V6W are in arithmetical progression. I think he probably made some little slip, however, in saying that. After displaying this wonderful demonstration of the law, Dr. Peirce said that instead of using the number 2, it would have been more exact to use 2.03. Now 2.03 is the square root of the cube of 1.61, which is */2 L and V5. The numbers are not quite right. Winking smiley. 2.06 is the square root of the square of */2 L and V5. But this will do as a model of bad induction.